For these next 2 Sundays, we are following the lectionary. And in doing so, we are taking another look at the slightly known book of Ruth. Now, in this time of the Me Too movement, as we're faced with something of a resurgence of patriarchy, this ancient text, this book of Ruth, has both wisdom and practical inspiration to offer us. In Ruth's story, we find the strategies and the courage for defining our own identities according to values that are somewhat countercultural, questioning what the world would say about who we are as both women and men, as natives and foreigners, about security and belonging. So as we prepare to delve into this saga of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, I invite us to keep in mind what we know about God's values and purposes in the world. First, God's love for all humankind, beyond nationality, beyond age, and beyond ethnicity. This is clear, I think, from the weaving of people other than Jewish people into the stories of God's work in the world. It's clear because even when the social order says, for example, that the eldest is to be chosen to be king or other things, that God chooses the youngest. We know, too, that God is the source. God alone is the source of identity and life for all people. We know this through Jesus' stories, stories like the Good Samaritan and the Syrophoenician woman. And the third thing is that we know that God values human freedom. We know this because of the Exodus. We know it because of the miraculous release of men and women from the troubles, from the demons that plague them. We know that God longs to set people free from all that would keep us from finding our true nature and purpose in relation to God and God's love. And so I invite us to bring these assertions about God to this story of Ruth and Naomi, this story of courageous love.
Evelyn started off the conversation with Mrs. Threadgood.
Now, Ruth left Whistle Stop and went off to Valdosta to get married.
That's right. Oh, and it like to have killed Iggy. She pitched such a fit.
I know. You told me about that. But what I want to know is, when did Ruth come back to Whistle Stop?
Evelyn settled in her chair, ate her chicken, and listened.
Oh, yes, honey. I remember the very day that letter came. It must have been 28 or 29. Or was it 30? Oh, well. I was in the kitchen with Sipsy when Mama came running back into the house with it in her hand. She threw open the back door and hollered for Big George, who was out in the garden. She said,
"George, go get Iggy right away and tell her she's got a letter from Miss Ruth."
George took off running to get her. About an hour later, Iggy came into the kitchen. Mama, who was shelling peas at the time, just pointed to the letter on the table without a single word. Iggy opened it. But the funny thing was, it wasn't a letter at all. It was just a page torn out of a Bible, King James Version.
Ruth 1, verses 16 to 20. And Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people will be my people, and thy God, my God."
Well, Iggy just stood there, reading that quotation over and over. Then she handed it to Mama and asked her what she thought it meant. Mama read it, put it down on the table and just kept on shelling her peas. She said,
Well, honey, it means just what it says. I think tomorrow you and your brother and Big George better go over there and get that girl, don't you? You know you're not going to be fit to live with till you do.
And it was
You know
true.
that.
She wouldn't have been. So the next day they went over to Georgia and got her.
Now, Evelyn, I admire Ruth for having the courage to walk away like that. It took real courage in those days, not like today, honey. But she was a lot stronger than people knew.
Scripture is from the book of Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife, Naomi. The name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the other Ruth. When they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons or her husband. She started to return with her daughters-in-law from Moab, for she had heard in Moab that God had consideration for the people of Judah and had given them food. So she and her 2 daughters-in-law went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you to your mother's house. May God deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. God grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud, and they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I had a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait till they are grown? Would you refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far better for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after her." But Ruth said,
"Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. I will come to love your people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, there I will die, and be buried by your side. May God grant our love to grow and never end. May you find your home in me, my beloved, my friend."
when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Amen.
And treat me not to leave you or to return from following after you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. I remember hearing these words as a child, mostly at weddings, I think. I remember, too, that they were from the book of Ruth. I probably remember that because it was one of 2 books in the entire Bible that had a girl's name. Actually, Ruth occupies a unique place in the Scriptures. Hers is the only book to be named after a foreign-born woman. I also remember in it the promise of friendship. This was a time that I remember this from, was evidently a time in my childhood when friends were becoming blood brothers and blood sisters. Do you remember that? Yep. When you'd prick your finger and you'd mix your blood with your good friends. And that says that you were committed to each other, that you were related, that you were claiming to be family. I knew this story then was about love, powerful, compelling love. The book of Ruth, I think it's important to know, is a novella. That is, it isn't a parable in which instruction is the point, nor is it directly communicated information about the role of God in people's lives. Rather, it's a saga of love and devotion that crosses lines of law and culture. The story involves an interplay between legal boundaries for women and for aliens, for those not of a particular land. And it includes the strategies and actions of these characters as they navigate those changing, those shifting boundaries. Those ancient laws define the identities of women, of widows, of kinsmen for their kinswomen, and of foreigners. But our characters, Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, make choices that go beyond the letter of the law. This is their story, and it's God's story of identity politics and religion. You heard the story, at least the first part of it. The narrative begins when Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons leave Bethlehem in Judah during a life-threatening famine. They journey to a neighboring place, to Moab. Bethlehem, of course, is in the land of the Hebrew people, the people of Yahweh. But Moab, on the other hand, is associated with hostility and sexual perversity. Its food is not used for feeding hungry people of Judah, but for feasting before local gods. The book of Genesis traces Moab's origin to acts of incest, and Moabite women were considered particularly dangerous, having the power to seduce Israelite men away from Yahweh. So, curiously, this is where Elimelech chooses to go in search of survival, to Moab. During their time in Moab, Elimelech dies. Both of their sons die, and both marriages, when the sons die, are childless. This seems a time of emptiness and sorrow. Only Naomi and the 2 Moabite wives of her sons remain. So Naomi does what she would do, especially since she's heard that the famine has lifted. She prepares to return to her home country, to Bethlehem. Her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. Now you know that was meant to be Oprah's name, right? Her name was meant to be Orpah, but somehow it got misspelled on the birth certificate. So, okay, I digress. Okay, so her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, prepare to accompany Naomi back to her country. Women who, according to the culture, had no value, no means of providing safety for themselves without being in the house of a father or a husband. So Naomi pleads with Orpah and Ruth to remain in Moab, where they can remarry and be with their own families. Orpah takes her counsel, but Ruth's affection for and devotion to Naomi are too great. She takes action and speaks words that in that society weren't even options. She clings, and thank you, Jerry, for emphasizing that word because it's a really important one. She clings to Naomi, and these two women take their lives into their own hands. These poor and, frankly, audacious women set out for Bethlehem. Ruth's action is not secured with promises about her future from either Naomi or from God. No promise of safety or land or money by which to live. She has only herself and her devotion to Naomi. Her act is the most radical commitment of love to another person that anyone could make. Scholars tell us that this expression of love is the commitment of a spouse. It's marriage vows, really the only marriage vows that scholars think are actually articulated in the scriptures. Wherever you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people shall become my people, and your God my God. Where you die, there I will die, and there will I be buried. According to Hebrew Bible scholar Amy Jill Levine, Ruth takes the closest physical position a woman takes to another in the scripture. She clings to her. Now, this is the same Hebrew word that's found in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, where it's used to describe Adam's connection and commitment to Eve. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cleave, it's translated here, shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Levine continues, sounding more like a spouse than a daughter-in-law, Ruth vows to lodge with and be buried with Naomi. She concludes with the statement that the deity should strike her were anything but death to part them. Ruth names her relationship to Naomi using words that depict a relationship that crosses the boundaries of age, of nationality, and religion, and of course, gender as well. Ruth chooses against the odds to stay with, to go with Naomi, one worthless woman joining herself to another. She refuses to accept society's limits that define women's existence as worthless and empty based on marital status or ability to bear children. The story of Ruth and Naomi is a story of belonging, belonging to a community, belonging to another, and belonging to God. Its characters raise questions regarding gender, ethnicity, religion, and otherness. It's about the integration of foreign-born people into the people of Yahweh, one of the principles I ask us to keep in mind. It's about reintegration into community without the requisite ways of belonging to that community. It's about patriarchal religious law and about surreptitiously subverting laws that kept women from living with autonomy and dignity. Remarkably because it's in the canon, remarkably, this ancient story focuses on women's experience and women's voices. This prominence of women in the text invites us to examine how it subverts, even as it serves, and we'll talk about this next week, even as it serves patriarchal law and culture. It offers the possibility of finding and hearing women's voices without whitewashing the patriarchal tendencies of the day. This is relevant and crucial for our current resistance to the resurgence of patriarchal rhetoric. Now, The pivotal character in this tale is Naomi, who has lost everything that gives her life meaning and security. But I have to tell you that I've been angry with Naomi all week. You see, I've read this story over and over, identifying issues, marveling at the strength of Ruth's love, and I've noticed behaviors, words, silences, and action of Naomi's that we may have tended to overlook. In using Ruth's words in wedding vows, we read this promise as one made between two people. But actually, did you notice? It's made from Ruth to Naomi. The vows are not reciprocal. In fact, Naomi tries to send Ruth back not once, but twice. Then, as far as the narrative itself is concerned, Naomi is silent in the face of Ruth's pledge of undying love. Naomi, then, may represent the woman who sees no way forward, no way to defy established norms. Over and over again, Naomi repeats the cultural mantra about what gives women worth in this ancient world. Over and over, Naomi tries to pull Ruth back into that world in which her identity and value are determined by her attachment to a husband and the bearing of children. Unless this was some sort of strategy for Naomi, and it might have been, she is setting Ruth up to be incorporated into the system that Ruth has just rejected by her presence there. Ruth's focus is on her love for Naomi. Her love compels her to extravagant words and actions. She does an unheard of thing. She steps completely out of the structure that tells her that she is a non-entity. She, a widow also, a foreign-born young woman who needed to be socially bound to a household for protection and for her own economic well-being, sheds those requirements of law and society to express her devotion. Ruth's love for Naomi, her desire to give Naomi a life again in her own homeland, her desire to be family to her, to live and build home together. This amazing love leads Ruth to defy all that would tell her that she couldn't do any of this, that she couldn't immigrate or survive or make decisions, that she couldn't find her own identity in Naomi's God alone, that she couldn't labor to sustain a household, that she couldn't promise faithfulness to another of her own choosing. But obviously, Ruth wasn't looking to be a part of the mainstream. She wasn't guided by convention or a desire for ease or social acceptance. Rather, she was guided by a desire to be with one she loved, to make family and home. She dares to think that somehow, with her own hands, she can bring food home to sustain life. Her love opened a world of possibilities of which others, including Naomi, could never conceive. Perhaps most amazingly, Ruth believes that she can actually be somebody, be fully human in herself and in Naomi's God alone, without the protection of another, without ownership of land, without citizenship. Ruth's love for Naomi and the depth of identity that comes from the Spirit within was great enough to break through the systems that would make her and Naomi non-persons without autonomy, less than capable members of the community. So what's the message for us in this text? The story of Ruth calls us, I believe, to see alternatives to cultural limitations, making a way from those who find themselves outside of what is accepted or approved. Ruth's intimate daring, her love, shows her alternatives that weren't even alternatives for her in her day. And this calls me to open my own eyes to all that limits human choice and dignity and autonomy. Ruth's action calls me to see the cultural rules that keep us identified by others, by society, and not by the one who calls us to fullness of life. Ruth refused to accept that her value came only through those prescribed means, or that her love for Naomi could be thwarted by law or custom. This brings us to the elephant that emerges in our modern reading of this story. A member of our worship team this week just asked it outright. So, do we think they are lesbians? The short answer, of course, is we have no idea, as we don't know. And the concept as we know it probably didn't exist for them. But many scholars and artists have speculated that Ruth and Naomi are committed to one another, whatever that means. The lesbian interpretation dates back at least to 1937 with the novel entitled Pity for Women by Helen Anderson. The two main characters, Anne and Judith, recite Ruth's famous vow in their commitment to one another. Ruth and Naomi also play a role in the award-winning 1971 historical novel Patience and Sarah. In 19th century New England, love blossoms between Sarah and Patience, who is an educated painter of Bible scenes. The first picture that Patience paints when they move in together is the embrace of Ruth and Naomi. And today's modern lesson from Fried Green Tomatoes is yet another invocation of Ruth and Naomi's love as a committed relationship between two women. I have a friend, Mona West, who is a Bible scholar and a specialist in the book of Ruth, and she believes that Fried Green Tomatoes is a retelling of the story of the book of Ruth. It's an interesting possibility. But regardless of the nature of the relationship between Ruth and Naomi, they loved each other, and that love crosses social boundaries. Ruth's pledge to Naomi calls us again to the truth that no one has the power to name us, to silence us, to assign us value based on the nature of our household, our citizenship, our relationships. So many of our assumptions, of our social assumptions, keep us bound, allowing us only to see and then, of course, act within systems. Sometimes we don't even see inequities around us because of what we assume. Sometimes we can't even hear through the silence or imagine other than the status quo. But Ruth shows us that our identity and value isn't found in the dictates of culture, and that love can find a courageous way forward. Secondly, the story of Ruth teaches us that a small, courageous act of love can indeed change the world. When we dare to believe that the prescribed way is not the only way. When we think only for a minute that God calls us to take the way, to follow the way that love draws us. Marie Fortune and I began our feminist theologies class this week. It was really a wonderful beginning. We had a room full of people. We read essays and sermons by 18th and 19th century women who dared to claim their rights, their God-given rights to vote and to work, to claim their inherent value, to raise their voices in a society that would tell them to go home and be quiet. What if these women had continued to believe that they shouldn't vote or teach or preach in the church? What if people in wheelchairs continued to assume that stairs were their problem? Or trans people assumed that they should use bathrooms of their birth gender? Or black and brown people assumed that they simply weren't as good as white people? But Ruth shows us another way, a way that sees the limits and sees a way to break through those limits with the courage to love and to declare that love. The story of Ruth calls us to love enough that we can see a different set of possibilities. And then to act, not intent on changing the world, but simply following the way of love. Can we open our eyes a little wider this morning? Can we allow love to spark our imaginations? Do we love enough to speak, to act, when the way of love is counter to cultural trends or norms? Do we believe that love can bring a new way? The book of Ruth is a radical inclusion in the biblical canon. It makes a bold statement about love across the lines and brings visibility to those often invisible in faith stories. Marriage vows spoken from one woman to another. Women veering from the standard culturally assigned course, making decisions for themselves. Ruth's leap of love and courage eventually produced hope for all of Israel. Ruth the Moabite, she was always referred to as an alien, and her appeals to Yahweh are all through Naomi. Ruth the Moabite was the great-grandmother of David, who became a symbol of a just and peaceful society. And this pagan woman is in the direct lineage of Jesus. Out of her love, Ruth acts. Out of the passion of her heart, she speaks. Her courage comes from her capacity to love, even when it challenges everything. May she inspire us with the courage to love. Amen. I invite you to be seated to receive the benediction and the blessing of the postlude. Oh, for a world where everyone respects each other's ways, where love is lived and all is done with justice and with praise. My friends, the creation, the realization of this sort of world takes more than anything the courage to love. The courage to love across the lines of culture and what is considered the norms of societies. And so my prayer for us as we go from this place is that we will, in the love of God, and with the example of Jesus that has gone before us, with the power of the Spirit living within us, that we too, like Ruth, will have the courage to love, to speak that love, that all may be free. Amen.